Bolivia has been on the brink of civil war for weeks. In recent months, the country has faced a coup, 2 assassination attempts against Evo Morales, one of them involving 14 shots fired at his vehicle, and a surge of street violence that looks more like Syria than a democracy. What's most alarming is that this isn't an isolated or short-lived episode. It's a symptom of a deeper structural collapse.
Violence in Bolivia. 5 dead in clashes between police and Evo Morales supporters.
The country is split in two. On one side, there's the government of Luis Arce, weakened, out of fuel, short on dollars, and with no solutions, but still holding formal political power. On the other, there's Evo Morales, now a fugitive from justice, accused of pedophilia, human trafficking, and attempting a coup. Yet he still controls the Chapar region as if it were his own personal stronghold, dug in against the law. The state doesn't enter there, Evo does, and they welcome him like a king. Meanwhile, outside that territory, the streets are on fire. Dynamite against police, buses set ablaze, blockades in key cities, and an economy that hasn't just stalled, it has collapsed. Inflation has climbed to nearly 25%, foreign reserves are on the brink of running out, and the government is already printing unbacked money in a bid to survive. In just a decade, Bolivia has gone from being the economic miracle of South America to a failed state, and that's no exaggeration. In 2014, Bolivia had over $15 billion in reserves. Today, it barely tops $1.7 billion. The irony is that Bolivia had everything it needed to succeed: gas, lithium, fertile land, and a young population, but it failed to use that wealth to lay the foundations of a strong economy. Now, however, on August 17th, elections will be held that could mark a turning point in this story. So the questions are, what led the country to this point? What options does it have to move forward? And can Bolivia avoid collapse? We'll tell you all about it in this video. Despite the near civil war that we're seeing in Bolivia right now, the truth is these problems didn't just start today. Bolivia's GDP has been stuck for the past 10 years. While Peru, Paraguay, and even Ecuador are trying to reinvent themselves, Bolivia remains trapped in a model dependent on depleted resources, with a state apparatus that spends more than it has and produces less than it promises. However, there was a time when this country was the engine of Latin America. Bolivia was growing faster than anyone, literally. While other countries in the region were dealing with crises, inflation, or stagnation, Bolivia was taking off. Between 2006 and 2014, its economy expanded by more than 150%. GDP was growing at double-digit rates, international reserves were soaring, and living standards were improving like never before. The secret to this success? Gas, lots of gas, and sky-high prices. Thanks to natural gas exports, mainly to Brazil and Argentina, the state's coffers were overflowing, and with that money, Evo Morales' government followed a simple recipe: redistribution, school grants, transport subsidies, aid for single mothers, hospitals, roads, schools, social housing, a public spending spree that transformed the country in no time. But there was a catch. All of it, every bit, depended on one thing: gas. And not just the gas itself, but on someone wanting to buy it, and at a good price. And of course, that didn't last forever. When gas revenues began to fall, no one wanted the party to end. Income plummeted, but public spending stayed the same. The redistribution model, which had once been funded by a surplus, began to rely on debt that grew until it shot above 80% of GDP. That figure might seem low compared to developed countries, but remember, Bolivia was still an extremely poor nation. The worst part is that during the boom years, the government failed to plant seeds for the future. There was no push to diversify the economy, develop industry, or create new sources of wealth. The result, when gas revenues dried up, dollars stopped flowing into the country. Bolivia began importing far more than it exported, and eventually the inevitable happened. The dollars ran out. And what happens when you run out of greenbacks? You can't import essential goods, one of them being oil.
The Bolivian government admits there aren't enough dollars to import fuel.
Without oil, gas stations run dry, truck drivers are left idle, goods don't reach factories, and people can't get to work. In short, the economy seizes up. Now, looking back, all of this seems obvious. An economy can't depend on a single sector. So why, after so many years of prosperity, did Bolivia fail to build a much more robust economic system? The reason comes with a name and a surname: Evo Morales. To understand what Bolivia is going through today, we have to go back to the past, to one very specific moment, December 18th, 2005. That day, Evo won the presidential elections, and it wasn't just any victory. It was the first time an indigenous person had risen to power in Bolivia, a historic event that changed the course of the country. Evo wasn't just another politician, he was the symbol of the revenge of the excluded, the peasant who made it to the Palacio Queimado, a place once ruled only by whites, oligarchs, or the military. And with that symbolism came a deeply ideological project. As soon as he took office, he expelled the DEA, the US anti-drug agency that had been operating in Bolivia since the 1980s. Why? Because for decades, it had been seen as a branch of US intervention in the region, but that wasn't the most surprising move. Evo legalized the coca leaf, nationalized natural resources, and refounded the country as the plurinational state. Evo was sweeping the elections, and the model seemed unstoppable. However, the euphoria began to sour when Evo sought to control the country while forgetting about democracy. You see, the 2009 constitution, driven by Evo himself, made something very clear. Only one consecutive presidential re-election was allowed. The problem was that when the time came, instead of stepping down after reaching the term limit, the president clung to power. How did he do it? First, he claimed that his first time didn't count because it hadn't taken place before the new constitution. The move worked, and he bought himself another 4 years. Then, when those 4 years were up, he wanted to run for a fourth term and called a referendum to scrap the re-election limit altogether. 51% of Bolivians voted against it. He couldn't stay in office. It looked like the end of his political career. But then came another trick. The Constitutional Court, controlled by Morales' party, ruled that preventing him from running violated his political rights. With that judicial decision, Evo ignored the referendum, sidestepped his own constitution, and ran anyway. And how did the election turn out? Well, according to him, he won. But that victory came with accusations of fraud. The streets filled with protests, blockades, and clashes. Bolivia turned into a powder keg. Then came the final blow. The Organization of American States published a damning report. It confirmed deliberate manipulation in the elections.
Final OAS report on Bolivian elections cites deliberate manipulation.
With that international backing, the pressure reached its peak. The armed forces withdrew their support for the president. Evo had no choice but to resign. After nearly 14 years in power, Bolivia's strongman left through the back door, literally, as he ended up in exile in Mexico or Argentina. And that could have been the end of the story. But there was still one last plot twist, because what came next was even worse. Evo had left Bolivia, but the cure turned out to be worse than the disease. Without a president, the country fell into a political limbo with a massive power vacuum. And in the midst of the chaos, a new name emerged, Jeanine Áñez, an opposition senator, a conservative Christian with little political clout. She was declared interim president in a parliamentary session without quorum and with half of Congress absent. Nationally, this proclamation was highly questionable. Áñez promised to bring peace to the country, but what followed was anything but peace. Her government, which was supposed to be short and transitional, turned into a revenge-driven administration from day one. The clearest sign, Decree 4078, an order that granted legal immunity to the military and police during law and order operations. In other words, giving them the power to enforce political tyranny. An example, on November 15th in Sacaba, police and armed forces opened fire on protesting coca growers. At least 11 people were killed. 4 days later, in Sen Carter, another operation left another 11 dead. Not a single officer was injured, but dozens of civilians ended up with gunshot wounds, serious injuries, or dead. Reports from international organizations such as the IACHR and independent experts literally described these events as state massacres.
The Bolivian prosecutor's office is seeking a 30-year prison sentence for former President Jeanine Áñez over the 2019 massacres.
The question is, what was Evo Morales doing in the meantime? He was seizing the moment. From Argentina, the former president mounted a fierce opposition to Áñez's government, accusing her of a power grab. This breathed new life into the former president's party. He stopped being the villain of the story, and that's when the 2020 elections came around. Evo was in exile. and couldn't run in the elections. The one who could was his former Minister of Economy, Luis Arce, a technocrat, serious, lacking charisma, but with a very powerful card to play. He was the architect of Bolivia's economic miracle. Yes, the same miracle built on natural gas. Arce represented calm in the middle of the storm, and the result was overwhelming. He won the election with more than 55% of the vote. And of course, with Arce in power, Evo had a clear path to return to the country. Morales was welcomed like a hero. Crowds cheering, coca leaves held high, Wipala flags waving. The leader was back. The problem with his return came division. Because even though Arce was now the president, Evo never stopped being the boss. That split in power quickly turned into an internal war. Arce needed to govern, but Evo had no intention of stepping into the background. He wanted to keep calling the shots, and he did. From Chapare, his historical stronghold, he began pulling the strings. A constant tension set in between the palace and the jungle, two centers of power for a single country and with different political projects. Arce's loyalists pushed for reforms. Evo's camp wanted to go back to the past, and all the while the economy kept sinking. In the end, things became so untenable that Luis Arce basically said, "I'm done with this," and withdrew his candidacy.
Luis Arce drops his bid for re-election in Bolivia and urges Evo Morales to do the same.
Now then, this withdrawal came with a catch. After stepping aside, Arce challenged Evo to do the same and make way for a new political generation. The response? Evo hinted he might step down, but reluctantly. He spoke of being disqualified, of persecution, but not of voluntarily retiring. Because, let's remember, his political machinery is a sort of parallel power operating in the shadows.
Evo Morales resigns himself to disqualification and hints he will end his bid to return to the elections.
Still, my friends, at this point, no one really believes Evo Morales has truly given up. We're talking about a former president who has defied referendums, courts, and even his own constitution to stay in power. And another president, Luis Arce. Well, what can I say? On June 26, 2024, a group of soldiers took control of the entrance to the Palacio Queimado in what many described as an attempted coup. But Zuniga, the coup leader, now under arrest, claimed it was actually a self-coup orchestrated by President Arce himself to clean up his image and strengthen his grip on power ahead of the 2025 elections. Arce denies this and blames Evo for the whole thing. So what can I tell you? Now the big question is the August elections. Neither of the two politicians is running, but each has basically appointed a successor to fight on their behalf. Andronico Rodriguez as Evo's heir, and Eduardo del Castillo as Arce's replacement. Who will win? Well, the most likely answer is neither of them. In fact, Bolivian society has grown so fed up with Evo and Arce's party that, according to the polls, their candidates combined wouldn't even get more votes than the third place contender. For now, the frontrunner in the polls is Samuel Doria Medina, a familiar face in Bolivian politics, a businessman and a moderate liberal. His plan has 5 key ingredients: recover the dollar supply by eliminating the black market for foreign currency, cut fuel subsidies to close the fiscal gap, shut down state-owned companies that only rack up losses, restore autonomy to the central bank, and open the doors to trade and foreign investment. But that's not all. He also wants to decentralize lithium management, which could become a major source of wealth for the country, and invest in sectors like agriculture, tourism, and technology. In short, less government, more private initiative. How will it all end? Will we see more coups or rigged elections? Could Bolivia's problems be solved with a more liberal president? Well, we'll find out soon. Share your thoughts in the comments and let's get the debate going. As always, if you enjoyed this video, give it a like and don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any of the next ones. See you in the next video. Take care. See you soon.